Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Nate Kazmarek, Vice President for Practice Groups and Networks at the Federalist Society. We are so pleased to once again partner with the wonderful team at DFI. They're just such a pleasure to work with. It's a great partnership, and we're looking forward. We had such a great morning, looking forward to the rest of this excellent fourth annual Education, Law, and Policy Conference. It's my privilege this afternoon to welcome our luncheon speaker, Paul Clement. His resume is familiar to many of you. Harvard College, Cambridge, Harvard Law School, clerkships with Judge Lawrence Silberman and Justice Antonin Scalia, Chief Counsel to the Senate Committee on the Constitution, Federalism, and Property Rights, and later he was the 43rd Solicitor General of the United States. If you just stop there, you have a very distinguished legal career. But Paul is also one of the most accomplished Supreme Court advocates in American history. He has argued over 100 cases before the court, and on one occasion, 3 in a single day. For most lawyers, one argument before the Supreme Court is the highlight of a lifetime. For Paul, it's just a Tuesday. And yet, his career is more than volume. It's about principle. Twice in his life, Paul has faced a choice: abandon a client or leave a prestigious law firm. In both instances, he walked away from the firm and kept the client. In one of his resignation letters, Paul cited Griffin Bell, who once wrote, "You are not required to take every matter that is presented to you, but having assumed a representation, it becomes your duty to finish that representation." Paul has lived those words, regardless of the cost, and he clearly is someone who embodies courage, integrity, and the noblest traditions of the bar. Please join me in welcoming Paul Clement.
So I told Nate to be kind in his introduction, but he was excessively kind, so thank you for that. I'm delighted to be with you, and wanted to, I'm coming here with a little bit of trepidation because there are many experts on education policy, education law in this audience, and I consider myself a generalist. But being a generalist, that means I think I can talk about almost anything. So I will be undeterred and give you a few thoughts about some of the issues I think that are facing college campuses right now, including anti-Semitism on the one hand and free speech challenges on the other. And I'll give you a few thoughts about maybe trying to reconcile what might be some tensions between those two things. I guess I'll start, though, just, it'd be odd to talk about this without sort of a reflection on all that is going on in the world right now, including, obviously, the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. I was recently on a panel, and an audience question was to the effect, to me and another person who teaches law, at least on the side, and they asked, does the current environment change the way that you teach constitutional law, or in my case, the separation of powers, which is what I teach at Georgetown Law? And my co-panelist said, well, not really. And when I got my turn, I said, absolutely. Because, I spent a lot of time, I've been teaching for over 20 years, and I spent a lot of time, especially in the separation of powers class, coming up with kind of tough, interesting hypotheticals. And now all my hypotheticals are actually happening. And so I have to come up with an entirely new, swath of hypotheticals. So in that vein, I wanted to start by talking about a non-hypothetical situation where I've been privileged to represent some plaintiffs, and that's what happened at UCLA in the wake of October 7th and as these sort of encampments started spreading across college campuses. But before I talk about the specifics of the UCLA case, I want to just lay the groundwork for why I was so pleased to get involved in that case in particular. And that is that kind of two things that I've felt a very strong commitment to, so strong that I was willing to sort of sign up to join outside groups in an advisory capacity, were on the one hand academic freedom, and I'd signed up for the advisory committee for the Academic Freedom Alliance. But the other thing is the problem of anti-Semitism on campuses. And Ken, who I think you'll hear from this afternoon, cajoled me to join the Brandeis Center's advisory board for the Center for Legal Innovation. So I've had these kind of personal commitments to both free speech rights on campus and to making sure that there wasn't this sort of pervasive climate of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And I recognize that there's some tension between those two, and there's some things that certain people would say, well, that's anti-Semitism, and others, including maybe myself, would say, well, it might be, but it's also free speech. And we have problems with not allowing free speech on our college campuses, so we have to be careful about sort of saying, well, you can't say that because that's anti-Semitic. And so in thinking about the tension, the UCLA case, when it arose, really sort of eliminated the tension. Because what happened at UCLA was not a simple matter of sort of the Jewish students on campus feeling like they were being sort of singled out for protests. It wasn't just a matter of some of the students who were very pro-Palestine sort of mistreating them or ostracizing them. It went well beyond that, and the facts of the case are really quite dramatic, because what had happened on the UCLA campus is the protesters, many of whom were not students at the university, but the protesters essentially erected an encampment in the absolute heart of the UCLA campus. And this encampment was situated such that it blocked access to the library, to the student union, and most of the other buildings that any student, law student, undergraduate student, whatever, would want access to. And then the kind of borders of this encampment were at first policed by some of the protesters, and they essentially required, in order to get access to the school facilities, essentially required students to give a little bit of a fealty to the pro-Palestinian, denounce Zionism, and the rest, or they couldn't get access to the other parts of the campus. Now, if that weren't bad enough, the university then, kind of understanding that this was going to be a flashpoint, arrayed a lot of security forces, personnel who were on the university payroll, some of whom were brought in as independent contractors, such that if you can sort of imagine the boundary of the encampment having all of these kind of security officers policing the boundaries. Now you might think, oh, well, this is great. This is sort of reminiscent of the 101st Airborne making a corridor so that the Little Rock Six could have their access to student facilities. But it was the opposite. These security officers basically helped police the boundaries of the encampment and essentially told Jewish students that really they should just sort of go away. And so you had this incredible situation where the university was not just sort of a bystander on this, but the university resources were being used essentially to enforce an anti-Jewish blockade in the center of campus. So whatever hard issues there are about reconciling free speech rights and getting at anti-Semitism, the UCLA case did not present those difficult questions. So I was very happy to get involved in this case along with the Beckett Fund and Davis Polk and my colleagues at Clement and Murphy to represent 3 students and 1 faculty member in challenging this. And relatively early in the case, we were able to obtain a preliminary injunction from Judge Scarsi in the Central District of California, and I'll just read to you from the very beginning of his opinion and in granting the preliminary injunction. And he writes, in the year 2024, in the United States of America, in the state of California, in the city of Los Angeles, Jewish students were excluded from portions of the UCLA campus because they refused to denounce their faith. This fact is so unimaginable and so abhorrent to our constitutional guarantees of religious freedom that it bears repeating. And that wasn't just rhetoric. Then Judge Scarsi repeated it and italicized it. Jewish students were excluded from portions of the UCLA campus because they refused to denounce their faith. So with that preliminary injunction in place, and reading and the rest of the opinion is of the same flavor, you can imagine that the university had to realize that nothing good was going to happen to them if they stayed in Judge Scarsi's court. And so they promptly filed a notice of appeal. But there was enough sort of outrage and negative reaction to the idea that UCLA would take this up on appeal that a few weeks later they withdrew the appeal. And once they did that, it seemed that sort of settlement was inevitable. And it took some time, but a settlement was reached. I should say that it no doubt helped that the Justice Department was also kind of looking into some of these incidents and continues to have an open matter about all of this. But a wonderful settlement, I think, from the standpoint of my clients was reached, where UCLA agreed to pay over $6 million, some to the students, I'll confess, some to the lawyers for attorney's fees. I think those things happen, and some to a variety of charities, Jewish charities, as part of the settlement. They also agreed to a permanent injunction, and I think that is a particularly important feature of this, because the current administration is doing a wonderful job in targeting anti-Semitism on college campuses, but it's in the nature of things that administrations come and go, and permanent injunctions do not. And so to have this ability to, if there's backsliding in a different administration with different priorities, to have the ability to go back into court with this injunction in place, I think is incredibly valuable, not just for my current clients, but for future generations of students at UCLA. I think the UCLA case is a kind of perfect example of ways in which things have gotten so out of control on some of the campuses that the lingering tension between sort of recognizing free speech rights on the one hand and targeting the problem of anti-Semitism on campuses is not an inherent tension. It's something that, at least in certain cases, things dovetail very nicely. In the sense that you can fight anti-Semitism without sacrificing your commitment to free speech principles. Now, let me sort of go beyond this, though, because let's hope that the UCLA has sort of learned its lesson, and in the current environment, something that extreme won't happen again. And so you can think about what are some sort of possibilities and suggestions that might kind of move both in the right direction on both the anti-Semitism front and on the free speech front. And I have some recommendations, but I'll start with repeating my sort of warning of humility. I realize I am here in a group of experts who spent a lot more time thinking about some of these things, so take this as just some observations from a generalist based on handling a couple of these cases and considering some other free speech cases along the way. In sort of making this, I was reminded by this great speech by Learned Hand on the spirit of liberty. And Learned Hand wrote, among other things in that relatively short speech, the spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. And I think that's good counsel for these times when there's divisive debates where everybody seems to be absolutely sure they're 100% right. But it's also good advice for me here, since I'm going to offer these observations. But I'm not 100% sure I'm right, but I think they're at least worth considering. The other thing I'll just say about Learned Hand is, of course, Learned Hand was probably pretty sure he was right. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite lines from law school. The great late Phil Arita was having us read some beautiful Learned Hand opinion that was written in all this great rhetorical flourish. And Professor Arita said, well, there is a saying in in the Second Circuit. And, Learned Hand was, of course, very famous, but his brother, Augustus Hand, was also a judge on the Second Circuit. And Professor Arita said, you should quote Learned, but you should follow Gus. So I always love that line. So here are my sort of 5 recommendations for what could both make free speech more of a reality on college campuses, but also be helpful in tackling the lurking and continuing problem of anti-Semitism. So the first thing I would say, and I'm certainly not alone in saying this, but I think a commitment to institutional neutrality is absolutely critical for most of the universities. I mean, a true principle of institutional reality doesn't work if you're a Catholic school, for example. A Catholic school, in my view, should not be institutionally neutral about Lutheranism. But for most public universities and for most private universities that don't have a religious affiliation, I think institutional neutrality is a great piece of the puzzle. And the principle of institutional neutrality is generally associated with the Calvin Report that was issued by the University of Chicago in 1967. And if you're either not familiar with that report or you haven't read it recently, it's worth reading. If for no other reason, then it's just 2 pages long. So it doesn't take a lot of time, and there's a lot of wonderful things in there. One of the principles that it lays down is, and I'll quote, "A university, if it is to be true to its faith in intellectual inquiry, must embrace, be hospitable to, and encourage the widest diversity of views within its own community." It seems absolutely right and absolutely central. And then it continues, the university, quote, "is a community which cannot take collective action on the issues of the day without endangering the conditions for its existence and effectiveness." And that's really the key principle, which is if you want to be institutionally neutral, then you have to resist the temptation to say that we, the University of X, find Y abhorrent or Z abhorrent, or this nominee to the Supreme Court should definitely be voted down, or this one should definitely be supported. Because once the university as an institution deviates from neutrality, it really chokes off free speech, free discussion, and the rest. Now, the good news here is that I think the Calvin Report is a little like the 27th Amendment. Those of you that are less familiar with the 27th Amendment, it was promulgated as part of the original Bill of Rights, but it didn't become ratified until 200 years later. Well, the Calvin Report was issued in 1967. Only a handful of schools adopted it contemporaneously. But in the wake of October 7th, in the wake of some of the recent troubles on campuses, more and more schools, I think, depending on the count, it's like 29 systems or over 100 schools, have adopted the Calvin Report and institutional neutrality principles, most of them in the last couple of years. So things are moving in the right direction on that front. The second point I would emphasize is intellectual diversity. And this, to me, goes hand in hand with academic freedom. As I mentioned, I'm a big proponent of academic freedom, and that's why I agreed to be part of the legal group advising the Academic Freedom Alliance. But academic freedom sort of becomes a trap if there's no intellectual diversity. If academic freedom just means that a whole bunch of liberals get to say all the crazy liberal things they want and have no consequences, and that's all it means, then it's really not worth fighting for. You really need to have sort of the intellectual diversity among the faculty to make academic freedom something that is worth fighting for. And so I think this is something that can really be highlighted. And I also think it's maybe something that could be a real focus in terms of shining a bright light on some of the universities that are out there. There are a lot of different ways of kind of measuring the intellectual diversity. But just one very rude calculus is, how many of the sort of faculty actually voted for a Republican in the last election? And at a lot of these institutions, that's going to be a single-digit number. And in a country that is, if it is nothing but divided politically, if the faculty is that out of whack with the sort of rest of the country and the general populace, it's a really ill sign for the universities, and it's not sustainable, frankly. And so I think of all of the different sort of potential reforms and all of the things to try to shine a bright light on, I think the lack of intellectual diversity among the faculty at many of these institutions is critical to focus on. So a third point, and this really came to me in talking to one of my sons yesterday about these issues, I think a renewed commitment by the universities to intellectual rigor would go a long way. Because one of the points my son made when we were talking about this is, I don't know, I had a pretty heavy course load, and I didn't really have time to protest things. And I think there's sort of some truth to that, which is, if you really make the students focus on the core function of the institution, which is to educate, take hard classes, learn new things in difficult ways, obviously there should be an ability for students to protest and make their views known. But to the extent they don't have a ton of time to do that, I think that's frankly all to the good and furthers the core function of the universities. And then this brings my fourth point, which I think is kind of related. But I think it is important for universities to distinguish between sort of insiders and outsiders. And one thing that I think universities can do that I don't think is inconsistent with free speech principles, some people in the audience may disagree with me on this, but there's nothing that says that a university campus has to be open to the general public in the way that the parks and sidewalks and the traditional public forums are. It's fine if the university wants to do that, or maybe have a designated part of the campus that's more of a free speech zone if it wants to. But the free speech zone should really be for students. And to the extent that adults who have no really meaningful affiliation with the university want to come in and rabble-rouse, that's not something a university has to allow. And to me, it brings in, I've thought a lot about this because I feel like I have a strong commitment to free speech, but I do think there are some more complicated issues that arise in the university context. And I think one of the mistakes that is sometimes made is to just analogize the campus green to the public park. And what's so different about it is that most of these campuses, they're not just the public green, but they're also the dining halls, the dorm rooms. These are places where the students have to live and interact. And it's for a lot of us, we can, if there's a protest that we don't like in the public square, we can sort of, relatively politely listen to it, or maybe not so politely listen to it. If we want to, we can engage in the other side. And then we can retreat to our homes where we can tell our loved ones and others what we really think. And we can do it without fear of retribution. We can do it in a way that allows us to, I think, almost give breathing space to have the pure public square a free-for-all. And I think we maybe underappreciate that for college students, and I think this is particularly true today of conservative students, but next week it could be other students. But I think for those students, they have to hear these protests, they have to experience these protests in the places that they eat and sleep and interact constantly. And I think there is room in the doctrine to sort of take that into account. But I also think, frankly, the universities would do themselves a great service if they did more to keep some of the outsiders out of some of the areas of campus. And because I think as a practical matter, in many of these protests, it's not the students who, no matter what their major is and no matter how lax the standards are, do have to go to class, do have to do some stuff. It's the people that are full-time protesters from the outside that are coming in and literally manning the barricades in places like UCLA. So the last observation I have is, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to start with a caveat, which is one of the most sort of, ongoing debates we have today is, is social media responsible for all of the world's problems or only most of them? And so I'll start with the caveat that I actually represent, the Metas of the world and on occasion the YouTubes of the world. And so I have a lot of sympathy for the argument that these are, first of all, platforms where a lot of debate happens and a lot of positive speech happens, and that those platforms should be generally open. But I'm also willing to take the position that these are not sort of public actors, so the First Amendment doesn't apply to them directly. So if they want to make the decision that for economic reasons they don't want to have certain kinds of speech on their platform, I think that's a permissible view. But I do think there's a lot of good that happens sort of online, but I think there are some problems with it. And I think one of the things that universities can try to do is to affirmatively bring some free speech kind of offline, if you will. Because I think one of the problems with online speech is you don't really have to even look at the people you're communicating with. You don't have to kind of take into account their reactions to what you're saying and the like. Whereas I think if you think back to kind of the classic dorm room conversations about controversial issues, I think one of the things that keeps those both robust but under control is the fact that you got to look at the person you're talking to. And you have to actually sort of take into account the way they're reacting to your speech. And I think in the same way, I think if universities can take some steps to, bring in speakers, have obviously a place where the speakers can actually speak, unlike, say, Judge Duncan's experience at Stanford Law School, but give them a chance to come in obviously in a space that's also kind of safe from threats, but to bring them in where you can actually have more of a dialogue. I also think there are steps you can take to, in certain classes, if the professors want, no computers in here. Because, I know from personal experience, sometimes what's happening is there's a discussion going on in the class, but there's also a text chain going on where, the liberal kids are saying, can you believe that conservative knucklehead just said that? And the conservative kids are having the same thread in reverse. And none of that is, I think, conducive to having a real interchange of ideas and a real openness. And I think the universities have an ability in some of these situations to not ban, access to social media. That would be crazy. But to just try to bring as much speech as possible sort of back offline where there's real interaction between real live humans who can actually see the way that their speech is affecting other people and make judgments about that, where to moderate, where to emphasize, and the like. So I don't know if those solutions will get us too far down the road, but I sure don't think they would hurt. So I'd urge those of you that are experts to figure out what I'm missing, but to take some of those observations from a generalist to heart. And so thank you for your attention. Really appreciate it. I think I'm supposed to take a couple of questions.
Right? There's been something like a purge. And the question is, how would you recommend that we accomplish intellectual diversity given the problems and niceties of hiring practices? And one point, some states have a requirement in their codes for balance on the Board of Regents, political balance on the Board of Regents, which is an indicator that balance is a good thing in education, but what would you recommend could be done lawfully?
So I think there's actually a fair amount that could be done lawfully, and I do think that sort of, kind of hiring practices are, an area where I do think if you pick up the rock, there's going to be a lot that you see under there, including some things where academic freedom on the one hand, but I think, there'd be situations where it would be pretty easy to make a claim of racial discrimination in the way that hiring takes place in some of these departments. So I think there is, real action for that. I also think, though, more generally, that this is something where there just has to be kind of public focus and, a little bit of sunlight here, I think would go a fair way. And, obviously, people in the Department of Education and elsewhere can do some of this investigation if they want to. But I think this is an area that really is problematic. And I will say it's going to be challenging because, and you're better aware of this than I am, but one of the kind of the bright spots has been that certain sort of particularly public universities, a lot of them in this sort of South, have recognized that things have gotten out of whack to the point where they've kind of created an institution within an institution that's much more oriented towards hiring more conservative scholars. And this has taken off enough that, the universities are starting to cannibalize each other. The few conservatives on the faculty that haven't been purged are now actually, ironically, in high demand. And so, you end up with this phenomenon where, one or two, the last couple of conservatives at some university are now headed south to some great new institution. But the problem is, they're leaving the students there kind of behind, and I don't fault them for moving to sort of friendlier areas, but it does create a real problem. And I think it's particularly true with the state schools, because I think there's a lot of sort of, great kids who never really think about going anywhere other than the flagship university in their state. And if they get there and there's not really like a single conservative, let's say in the government department, which is probably true at the average state university, that's just a fundamental problem. And it's a problem, I think some of the universities in the current climate are starting to recognize that it's a problem. So I think there is the possibility of this being an inflection point.
Hi, Mr. Clement. Thanks for coming out and speaking to us tonight. I really appreciate it. My name is Alex Reynolds. I serve as president of Scalia Law's Federalist Society chapter. And I wanted to ask you a question about, there's a lot of college campuses that are entirely banning entire forms of expression like chalking or signage on campus in the name of, cleaning up, temporary vandalism. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and how a lot of universities are doing that after October 7th and the protests there.
Yeah, so, two things. One, I applaud you getting your law school's name right. I occasionally run into somebody that tells me they go to George Mason Law School. It drives me bananas as a Scalia clerk. So, yes, Scalia Law School, maybe at George Mason or whatever, if you got to throw that in there. But plaudits on that. Second, to answer your question, to me, that's an example of the overreaction. And this is why I think there is some sort of tension here, because, I think, at some level, you can't just say that in the name of rooting out anti-Semitism, we're going to root out sort of the ability to have free speech on campus. And I don't, like I said, I think there are ways of, I actually think the best solution here, in some respects, is to be honest that at the extremes, there's some tension. And that we really have to sort of think hard about this and find out, okay, what's the overreaction? How can we reconcile these things? And I think the 5 things I've talked about, I think, are perfectly consistent with sort of free speech principles. There might, I might have a friend at FIRE who disagrees with me on 1 or 2 of them, but I think they're consistent with free speech principles. But banning signage, kind of is not. It's classic sort of overreaction. And it's overreaction, frankly, that is going to ultimately, I think, hurt the Jewish students. It's going to certainly hurt the conservative students. I mean, if you got a place that's kind of, doctrinally pretty pro-Palestine and pretty left-leaning, and you say no signage, I mean, that's not a neutral rule. That has a valence of its own, and it's going to make it sort of harder for the Jewish students to find each other, the conservative students to find each other. It's going to become harder to bring speakers onto campus that can challenge the consensus orthodoxy and all of the rest. So I think that's a perfect example of something that's an overreaction that, and maybe at a private university there might not be state action, I'll grant you that, but it certainly doesn't seem consistent with free speech principles.
Hi, Mr. Clement. My name is Brian Scala. I recently graduated from the George Washington University Law School.
Another good name, for sure.
Yeah, he's really the best. My question is around, right now the president is talking about with immigration visas and work visas, reviewing people's social media history and questionnaires about, for lack of a better term, their anti-Americanism, and how that plays with some of the professors thinking about universities like Columbia, professors who have come here and who are pretty much pretty anti-American scholars. Can you speak to the constitutionality and the practicality of doing that? And does that kind of corrupt the institutions if we start screening people too vigorously versus really kind of, on the opposite side, just self-harm to the country of bringing these people in?
Yeah, and I guess I'd answer that in terms of this is why, to me, like intellectual diversity and academic freedom go hand in hand. Because as a fan of academic freedom, I'm a big believer that we should have some anti-American professors. But that presupposes we have some pro-American professors as well. And if we're not going to have any pro-American professors, then I totally get why we would start saying we can't have all this anti-Americanism. That's all the students are hearing. So to me, the solution is not to keep out the anti-American professor from the United States who's coming from some other country, but is to just make sure that there really is robust intellectual diversity. Now I know it's easier to keep out a couple of professors than it is to introduce intellectual diversity into some of our universities. So I can sort of understand the temptation to go that route, but from my standpoint, I would really want to insist on trying to deal with the problem in a more long-term solution way. And I guess I will confess, I say this in part based on personal experience. When I did a master's degree in England, and one of my favorite professors who I learned a ton from was an avowed Marxist in the econ department at Cambridge. Now, he did not turn me into a communist, I guarantee it. And I stuck with my free market principles as an econ student, but I was so much better at defending them and so much more thoughtful in sort of confronting the counter views and the rest because I had somebody who was not shy about being a Marxist. And, so that's part of where my views about academic freedom becomes, so important. And I will say that continued to benefit me, even at Harvard Law School, because I got to Harvard Law School and I had these liberal professors, but my first reaction was, you don't even have the courage of your convictions. Professor Sender at Cambridge at least told you he was a Marxist. You're trying to hide that from me. So I really do believe in academic freedom, but it's got to be in a context where there is real intellectual diversity.
Terms like homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism can be used to be the silver bullet to shut down discussion. How do you distinguish between what might be anti-Semitism, or is someone able to criticize nations with actual outright anti-Semitic speech, so we don't go that direction? And I'd only comment that you were able to challenge your Marxist professor because he lived in a place where he could exist and not be shot and killed for his beliefs. So I just would like you to address word usage matters. How would you address the claim of, or falling into the era of anti-Semitism being used in the way that Islamophobia and homophobia has been to shut down discussion?
So it's a very sort of hard question, and it's part of why I was drawn to a case like the UCLA case that sort of gets around some of the hard questions. And shows you where sort of this can go. Now, my own view is that you have a right to speech that's anti-Semitic, that's Islamophobic, homophobic. You fill in the blank, and where it starts to sort of cross lines is when you start to direct it specifically at the students in ways that are threatening, and the rest. And so there are situations where you have to sort of draw those lines. One of the things that makes it sort of difficult is on anti-Semitism in particular is that we don't even have an agreed upon definition of anti-Semitism. And my own view is that we shouldn't run away from defining the term. We should try to do it, and we should recognize, though, as we're defining it, we're not saying that therefore that you can prohibit anti-Semitic speech just because we've defined it. It just means now we can evaluate conduct, and we can decide if the conduct is limiting access, and I'm thinking about this now in Title VI terms, but if the conduct is blocking access to certain students, then we can use the definition to help inform whether it's actionable or not. So I think there are ways that we can kind of move in a direction that sort of helps us answer the hard questions. But I'm not here to tell you there aren't hard questions. Kind of the premise of this is if you're committed to academic freedom and free speech and you really want universities to do more to fight anti-Semitism, you have to make some kind of hard calls. And I think you can, but this is too where as a generalist, I actually think the First Amendment doctrines ends up sort of supplying some pretty good answers because, we generally are very, very pro-free speech, but we do have exceptions for things like fighting words. We do have exceptions for things like true threats. And there's just a difference between saying, the river to the sea on the one hand and saying, death to Jews while pointing at a Jewish student on the other hand. Those are different situations. And I think we got to figure out a way to distinguish those and prohibit the latter. I think we're done. Thank you.
Always reticent to cut things short with Paul. Thank you very much for your valuable time and insights. You're always so generous, and we're very grateful. The next programming note is we will move to the original room we were in next door. That debate on immigration enforcement will start promptly at 1:30, so we have a short break, and we'll see you all at that panel. Thanks.